That withdrawal cannot be processed. The words landed like a final stamp on silence, sharp enough to make the air inside the downtown Chicago branch feel heavier than the glass walls surrounding it. Maya Carter stood still at the counter, her hands resting lightly on a folder that contained everything she had prepared twice over, her identification, her account details, and the authorization papers she had been told would be enough. Behind the counter, Richard Hale didn't look up right away. He tapped once on his keyboard, eyes scanning a screen filled with numbers that meant nothing to anyone waiting in line except him. "I already told you," he added flatly, finally lifting his gaze with a practiced calm that felt more like dismissal than explanation. "Your request is flagged. Until verification clears, there will be no withdrawal." The words were not loud, but they carried. A few customers in line shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen while listening to every syllable. Maya's expression didn't change immediately. She had learned over the years that reacting too fast only gave people permission to define the moment for her. "It's my account," she said evenly, her voice steady but controlled, as if she was holding something fragile inside it. Richard leaned back slightly, folding his arms with the kind of confidence that came from being obeyed too many times without question. "And the system still says hold," he replied, emphasizing the word system as if it was something beyond human influence, something untouchable. Behind Maya, the faint sound of a printer echoed across the polished marble floor, spitting out receipts no one was ready to pick up. The bank smelled like recycled air and faint coffee from the lounge corner, a sterile calm that made every human interaction feel like it didn't belong. Maya glanced down at her folder again, then back up. Her mother was in a hospital across town, and every hour mattered in ways that couldn't be translated into banking procedures or compliance codes. She exhaled slowly. "Then escalate it," she said. Not a request this time, but a quiet insistence that cut through the script of the room. A faint smirk touched Richard's face, not enough to be called kindness, just enough to show certainty. "You don't escalate decisions like this," he said. "You wait for them." The line behind her shifted again. Someone cleared their throat, pretending urgency elsewhere. Maya felt it then, not anger, but something colder, recognition of a pattern she had seen before in different places, different faces, always the same invisible wall dressed up as procedure. Richard turned slightly toward his monitor again, already signaling that the conversation was over in his mind. "Next customer," he called out, voice smooth, rehearsed, final. Maya didn't move. For a brief moment, she simply stood there, her reflection faint in the glass partition, blending with rows of numbers and system tabs that kept blinking in silence. Then, behind Richard's shoulder, the screen flickered once, a small hesitation in the digital rhythm of the bank, followed by a faint red notification that neither of them noticed at first, labeled in quiet capital letters, "Compliance Alert Pending Review." Inside the downtown Chicago branch, the atmosphere shifted in a way no one could immediately explain, as if the building itself had registered something unusual beneath its usual rhythm of transactions and polite conversations. Maya Carter remained standing at the counter, her posture unchanged, but her attention subtly shifted toward the faint flicker she had noticed behind the banker's shoulder moments earlier. Richard Hale, however, had already moved on mentally, his focus returning to the customer queue and the familiar authority he exercised over it. He pressed a key on his desk phone and gestured lightly toward the waiting line. "We are handling delays due to standard verification protocols," he announced, his tone rehearsed and controlled, designed to close questions before they could form. A few customers nodded reluctantly, accepting the explanation the way people often accept systems they do not fully understand. Maya tightened her grip on her folder slightly, her mind running through the timeline she had been given by the hospital earlier that morning, where her mother was waiting for a procedure that required immediate payment clearance. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she took a small step closer to the counter, as if shortening the distance could bridge the gap between policy and urgency. "I am requesting one more time for escalation," she said calmly, each word measured, careful not to break the fragile structure of the conversation. Richard let out a quiet breath through his nose, the kind of sound that suggested impatience rather than consideration. "There is nothing to escalate at this level," he replied, sliding a printed form across the counter without looking at her directly. "You can submit an inquiry and wait for review like everyone else." Behind them, the faint hum of the air conditioning filled the silence that followed, amplifying the discomfort of the people standing nearby. Maya looked down at the form but did not take it immediately. Something about the tone, the repetition, the refusal to acknowledge urgency as anything other than inconvenience, felt familiar in a way she did not want to recognize. She had encountered variations of it before in smaller offices, different cities, different people, but always the same structure of dismissal wrapped in procedure. She finally placed her hand on the paper, not taking it but holding it in place for a moment. "My account is not a routine case," she said quietly, her voice steady but carrying a weight that made a few heads in line turn slightly. Richard's expression tightened just a fraction, not enough to signal concern, but enough to show irritation at being challenged in front of others. "Every account is a routine case until proven otherwise," he replied, his tone flattening again as he turned slightly toward his monitor, signaling the conversation was losing importance in his internal hierarchy. At that exact moment, the faint red notification behind him blinked again, brighter than before, shifting from a passive alert to a more active warning state, though neither of them acknowledged it yet. The screen briefly refreshed, as if pulled by an unseen directive, and the word compliance remained visible a second longer than it should have. Maya's eyes caught it again, this time more clearly, but she said nothing, simply watching the banker who had already decided she was no longer the priority in the room. The air between them grew quieter, not from resolution, but from the growing imbalance of information neither side fully understood yet. The quiet tension inside the bank branch began to shift in a way that was not immediately visible but slowly perceptible, like pressure building beneath glass that had not yet cracked. Maya Carter remained at the counter, her presence steady, but her attention was now divided between the banker in front of her and the subtle changes unfolding behind him. Richard Hale adjusted his posture, glancing at the queue with increasing impatience, as if the delay itself had become an insult to his authority rather than a matter of procedure. He reached for his keyboard again, fingers tapping faster now, attempting to resolve the situation through repetition rather than reconsideration. "I am going to close this interaction and move to the next client," he said, not raising his voice, but making it clear that the conversation had reached its limit from his perspective. Maya did not move immediately. Instead, she studied him with a calm that did not match the pressure of the moment. The fluorescent lighting above reflected faintly in the glass panels surrounding the counters, casting a pale glow over the polished surfaces and the waiting customers who were now less focused on their own transactions and more attentive to what was unfolding. "I am asking for formal escalation," Maya said again, her voice measured and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of urgency she had been holding back since she entered the branch. Richard exhaled slightly, shifting his gaze toward her for a longer moment than before. "And I am telling you that your request does not meet the threshold for escalation," he replied, his tone steady but increasingly rigid, as though consistency alone could substitute for resolution. Behind him, the monitor flickered once more, this time more distinctly, a brief interruption in the otherwise stable interface. A small notification expanded in the corner of the screen, displaying a system status update that neither of them acknowledged yet, marked in quiet but unmistakable lettering that indicated a compliance-level review had been initiated externally. The hum of the bank seemed to deepen, not louder, but heavier, as if the air itself was responding to something just outside of awareness. Maya's eyes briefly shifted toward the screen again, registering the change without reacting outwardly. Richard, however, remained focused on control, sliding another document forward as if paperwork could override uncertainty. "You can file a dispute through customer service," he added, his tone flattening further. "This is the standard process." Around them, the line of customers remained still, their earlier impatience replaced by a kind of silent curiosity, the instinctive human response to a situation that no longer felt routine. Maya placed both hands lightly on the counter, not aggressive, not withdrawn, simply present, as though anchoring herself within a system that was refusing to acknowledge urgency. "Standard process does not account for time-sensitive medical clearance," she said quietly, her words precise, carrying a clarity that contrasted sharply with the procedural language surrounding her. For the first time, Richard's expression shifted slightly, not into concern, but into irritation at the persistence of a narrative that did not align with his authority. He turned slightly toward his terminal again, but paused, his eyes catching the screen for a fraction longer than before. The notification had changed, expanding into a more formal alert state, with system routing indicators now visible along the edge of the display. Still, he did not fully register it, his attention anchored in the immediate interaction in front of him. Maya remained still, watching not him, but the environment around him, as if recognizing that the conversation was no longer contained within the counter itself. The atmosphere inside the branch had subtly shifted from routine banking activity into something closer to anticipation, though no one could yet identify the source of it. The atmosphere inside the bank branch shifted again, this time in a way that was no longer subtle. It was not loud, and it was not visible in any dramatic form, but it was undeniable in the way conversations around the room began to slow, and in the way customers who had been waiting in line started to glance toward the counter more frequently. Maya Carter remained in the same position, her posture steady, her expression calm, but her awareness sharpened as the interaction with Richard Hale entered a more rigid phase. Richard adjusted his tie slightly, a small gesture that suggested discomfort he would never openly acknowledge. He looked at the queue again, then back at Maya, as if trying to decide whether to end the conversation entirely or reassert control through procedure. "This is the final time I will address this," he said, his voice measured but firm, signaling closure rather than conversation. "Your request does not meet verification standards for immediate release, and I will not override compliance protocol for any individual case." His words carried the tone of institutional authority, the kind that was meant to sound absolute rather than negotiable. Maya exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in a controlled pause that suggested she was carefully choosing her next response. Around them, the faint sounds of typing, paper shifting, and distant phone calls created a backdrop that contrasted with the stillness forming at the counter. A customer near the front of the line leaned slightly to one side, trying to see the interaction more clearly without drawing attention. Richard turned partially toward his monitor again, but something made him hesitate. The screen in front of him had changed subtly since the last time he looked. The previous small alert had expanded into a structured system notice, and now additional lines of information were visible beneath it, indicating escalation pathways and external review status. For the first time, a slight tension entered his posture, though he still did not fully acknowledge it. Maya, however, had noticed the change more clearly. She did not comment on it, but her gaze briefly shifted from Richard to the monitor and back again, as if confirming that something beyond their conversation was now influencing the situation. "I am not asking for special treatment," she said quietly, her voice steady and even. "I am asking for the release of my own funds under documented authorization." Richard's jaw tightened slightly, a subtle sign of resistance rather than response. "And I am telling you that the documentation is under review," he replied, emphasizing the final word as though it carried sufficient authority to end the matter. At that moment, the screen behind him refreshed again, this time more noticeably, as if the system itself had moved from passive notification to active intervention. A structured alert banner appeared across the top of the interface, briefly changing the color tone of the display. The words indicated that a regional compliance directive had been initiated, though neither Maya nor Richard spoke them aloud. The change in the screen drew the attention of a junior employee at a nearby station, who paused mid-task and glanced toward the counter with uncertainty. Richard finally noticed the reaction around him, and for the first time, his expression shifted from irritation to something closer to concern, though he did not yet fully understand its source. Maya remained still, her hands resting lightly on the counter, as the silence between them grew heavier, no longer defined by disagreement alone but by the growing presence of a system responding beyond their control. The silence at the counter no longer felt like an absence of sound but like a held breath that no one in the room knew how to release. Maya Carter remained still, her presence unchanged, yet everything around her seemed to recalibrate in slow motion. Richard Hale glanced between the monitor and the growing attention from customers, his earlier confidence beginning to fracture in subtle ways he could not fully control. The system notification on his screen expanded again, now occupying a larger portion of the interface, displaying structured compliance language that referenced external authorization layers he did not immediately recognize. His fingers hovered over the keyboard without typing, a rare hesitation breaking through his usual procedural certainty. "This is still under internal review," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier finality, carrying instead a controlled uncertainty that he tried to mask with repetition of standard phrases. Maya did not respond immediately. Instead, she observed the shift in the room, the way a few customers had stopped pretending to look away, and how even the distant sound of phone calls from other counters seemed to slow. The environment was beginning to respond to something larger than the interaction at the counter. Richard leaned slightly closer to his monitor, scanning the updated alert. New text had appeared beneath the original compliance notice, indicating that an external audit channel had been activated. The term was not unfamiliar to him, but its presence in this context was unexpected. He adjusted his posture again, attempting to regain composure, but the rhythm of the situation no longer aligned with his control. "There appears to be a system flag on your account," he said, now addressing Maya with less certainty and more caution. His tone had shifted from dismissal to reluctant acknowledgement. Maya's expression remained calm, but her eyes reflected awareness rather than surprise. "Then follow the flag," she said simply, her voice steady and direct, without escalation or emotion. The phrase lingered in the space between them longer than expected. A junior employee near the back counter stood up slightly, trying to see the monitor more clearly, while another customer lowered their phone, no longer pretending to be disengaged. Richard hesitated before responding, his hand moving toward the keyboard, then stopping again as another update populated the screen. This time, the alert was accompanied by a directive requiring temporary suspension of discretionary transaction decisions on flagged accounts pending review. His throat tightened slightly as he read it, though he did not speak the words aloud. The authority he had relied on moments earlier was no longer fully aligned with the system he was expected to enforce. Maya remained composed, her hands still resting on the counter, as if she had already anticipated that the situation would move beyond verbal exchange. Richard finally exhaled a controlled breath that revealed more than he intended, and for the first time, he looked at Maya not as a routine customer, but as a variable he could no longer categorize within his usual framework. The bank branch, once defined by predictable flow and quiet transactions, now felt suspended in an unfamiliar state where every action paused just slightly longer than it should, waiting for something no one had yet named aloud. The bank branch fell into a stillness that no longer felt natural, as if the entire space had been placed under a quiet suspension that affected every sound, movement, and intention within it. Maya Carter remained at the counter, her posture unchanged, but her attention was now fully aligned with the subtle transformation unfolding around the system terminals. Richard Hale stood slightly rigid behind the counter, his earlier confidence replaced by a controlled stillness that masked growing uncertainty. The monitor in front of him continued to update, the interface no longer behaving like a routine banking system but instead reflecting layered notifications that appeared beyond his usual administrative scope. He read the screen again, slower this time, his eyes narrowing as additional structured lines of text populated beneath the compliance alert. The language had shifted from internal review to external authorization verification, indicating that the account in question was now subject to a broader financial oversight protocol. He swallowed once, a subtle movement that betrayed discomfort he was not prepared to express. "This is an automated hold initiated by external compliance authority," he said finally, though his tone lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. It was no longer a declaration of control, but an explanation of a system that no longer belonged solely to him. Maya did not respond immediately. Instead, she observed the change in his behavior, noticing the difference between instruction and interpretation. The bank environment around them had also changed in small but noticeable ways. Conversations near the counters had nearly stopped, and even the distant sound of cash drawers and keyboards had softened, replaced by a quiet attention that spread across the room. Richard moved his hand toward the phone on his desk, then paused, as another notification appeared on the screen, this time accompanied by a directive indicating that a regional compliance officer had been notified and was en route for verification review. His expression tightened slightly, the first visible sign that the situation was no longer contained within standard procedure. He turned his head slightly toward Maya, studying her with a new level of caution that had not been present before. "There may be a delay while this is resolved," he said, now choosing words carefully rather than authoritatively. Maya's expression remained calm, but there was a quiet firmness in her presence that suggested she had already accepted the shift in circumstances without needing confirmation. "I understand the process," she replied evenly, her voice steady and controlled. The phrase was simple, but it carried an unspoken weight that contrasted with the escalating complexity of the system behind the counter. Richard looked back at the monitor again, where the compliance status had now transitioned into a live review state, indicating active oversight. A faint reflection of the screen light illuminated his face, emphasizing the subtle tension in his posture. He was no longer dismissing the situation, nor was he fully in control of it. Instead, he was positioned between protocol and uncertainty, forced to wait on a system response that was no longer predictable. Around them, the branch remained unusually quiet, as if every customer had instinctively recognized that the interaction at the counter had shifted from a routine transaction into something procedural and unresolved, where authority was no longer defined by presence alone but by something operating beyond visible control. The silence inside the bank branch deepened into something that felt almost structured, as if every person inside had unconsciously aligned themselves with the unfolding process rather than resisting it. Maya Carter remained at the counter, her posture unchanged, but her awareness was now fully attuned to the subtle recalibration happening within the system. Behind Richard Hale, the monitor in front of him continued to update in real time, each refresh bringing new layers of authorization and oversight that shifted the nature of his control over the situation. Richard stood slightly rigid, his earlier attempts to assert procedural certainty now replaced with measured observation. His eyes moved across the screen more slowly than before, absorbing details that were no longer within the familiar boundaries of branch-level authority. The compliance status had transitioned again, now indicating that the account review had been escalated to a verified regional oversight channel with active monitoring. A faint reflection of that update flickered across his face, revealing a tension he could no longer fully conceal. "We are currently under external review instructions," he said, his voice lower and more cautious than before, no longer projecting authority but rather acknowledging it had shifted elsewhere. Maya did not respond immediately. Instead, she observed the room, noticing how the earlier curiosity from customers had transformed into silent attentiveness. Even the staff in the background had slowed their movements, as if instinctively aware that normal operations were no longer the priority. Richard placed one hand on the edge of the counter, steadying himself in a way that suggested he was recalibrating his understanding of the situation in real time. Another update appeared on the screen, this time accompanied by a structured directive indicating temporary suspension of discretionary handling for the flagged account pending direct compliance verification. The wording was precise, formal, and unmistakably outside the usual branch-level process. Richard read it twice. His jaw tightened slightly, and for the first time, he did not attempt to immediately interpret or justify it. Instead, he paused. Maya's expression remained steady, her calm presence contrasting with the increasing procedural complexity unfolding behind the counter. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly, her voice even and measured, not demanding but simply seeking clarity. Richard hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. "We wait for compliance confirmation to proceed," he said, though the phrase no longer carried the same authority it once would have. It now sounded like acknowledgement of dependency rather than control. The atmosphere in the branch had shifted again, not through sound or motion, but through recognition. Several customers who had been watching now looked away, as if sensing that what was happening no longer belonged to routine banking activity but to something larger and more structured than their immediate understanding. The monitor behind Richard refreshed once more, briefly displaying a secondary authorization identifier linked to external review personnel who had not yet arrived physically but were already active within the system. Richard exhaled slowly, his posture straightening slightly as he accepted the reality that the decision-making process had moved beyond his immediate authority. Maya remained composed, her presence steady, as the environment around her settled into a new kind of stillness defined not by dismissal or conflict, but by procedural waiting that neither side could accelerate or control. The stillness inside the bank branch reached a point where it no longer felt like waiting, but like suspension, as if time itself had paused to allow the system behind the counter to complete a process no one in the room fully understood. Maya Carter remained at the counter, her expression unchanged, but her attention now fully aligned with the final stage of the procedural shift unfolding on the monitor behind Richard Hale. Richard stood with a posture that had subtly changed over the past few minutes. The confidence that once defined his presence had been replaced by a more restrained stillness, as if he was now operating inside a framework that no longer responded directly to his authority. The screen in front of him displayed a structured confirmation pathway, indicating that the external compliance review had transitioned into final authorization validation. Each update appeared in measured intervals, each one reducing the ambiguity of what was happening while simultaneously removing his ability to influence it. He read the latest message slowly, his eyes scanning every line before he finally spoke, his voice noticeably softer than before. "We are now awaiting final confirmation from compliance oversight," he said, no longer presenting it as procedure, but as fact. Around them, the branch had become almost entirely silent. Customers who had been waiting earlier now stood in place without conversation, their attention drawn to the counter not out of curiosity alone, but out of recognition that the situation had moved beyond ordinary banking activity. A junior employee near the back of the branch glanced repeatedly at the central system display, as if trying to confirm whether what they were seeing was real or temporary. Maya remained composed, her hands resting lightly on the counter, her posture steady, not pressing forward, not stepping back, simply present within the moment as it unfolded. Richard finally turned slightly toward her, his expression no longer defensive or dismissive, but controlled and careful. "Your account is currently under active compliance authorization," he said, choosing formal language that reflected the system rather than his interpretation of it. Maya nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without altering her calm demeanor. The monitor behind Richard refreshed again, this time displaying a final verification sequence indicator, accompanied by a status change that shifted the entire tone of the system interface. The color palette on the screen subtly changed, signaling transition from review to resolution stage. Richard noticed it immediately. His hand moved away from the keyboard, no longer attempting adjustments or inputs, as if he had reached the boundary of his role in the process. For the first time, he stepped slightly to the side, creating physical distance from the counter and the screen, as though repositioning himself outside the center of control. Maya's gaze remained steady, not on the screen, but on the space between them, where authority, procedure, and outcome were now converging without human intervention. The branch manager's voice lowered further as he spoke again, almost as if confirming reality rather than directing it. "Final clearance is being processed," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of conclusion. The room remained silent, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that mattered was now happening within a system that no longer required discussion. Maya did not react outwardly. She simply stood, patient and composed, as the final stage of verification continued to unfold in quiet, irreversible progression. The final moments inside the bank branch unfolded with a quiet intensity that did not resemble chaos, but rather completion, as if every prior layer of uncertainty had been gradually stripped away to reveal a single unavoidable outcome. Maya Carter remained at the counter, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, as the final stage of the compliance process reached its conclusion on the monitor behind Richard Hale. Richard stood slightly to the side now, no longer attempting to intervene, his attention fixed on the screen with a controlled stillness that reflected acceptance rather than authority. The interface displayed a final authorization confirmation sequence, its structured indicators shifting from active review to approved status in a gradual progression that left no room for interpretation. A moment later, the system updated again, this time replacing the prior alerts with a formal resolution notice confirming full compliance clearance and lifting of the temporary transaction restriction. The change was subtle in appearance but absolute in effect. Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly as he read the confirmation. "The hold has been lifted," he said quietly, his voice carrying less formality now and more acknowledgement of outcome than instruction. Around the branch, the silence shifted. It was no longer the silence of anticipation, but the silence of resolution. Customers who had been watching now returned to stillness, some glancing away as the tension that had held their attention finally dissolved. A faint notification tone echoed from one of the internal systems, signaling completion of the compliance cycle. Maya did not move immediately. She simply observed the space for a moment longer, as if confirming that the change was not temporary or uncertain. Richard turned slightly toward her, his expression no longer defensive or authoritative, but composed in a way that suggested recalibration. "You may proceed with your transaction," he said, now using a tone that reflected procedural closure rather than control. Maya nodded once, calmly, acknowledging the statement without urgency or hesitation. She extended her hand toward the counter as the system behind Richard stabilized fully, all prior alerts replaced by standard operational status indicators. The branch environment gradually returned to its baseline rhythm, the subtle background sounds of banking activity resuming as if the interruption had never occurred. Yet something in the atmosphere remained altered, not in structure, but in perception. Richard remained still for a moment longer, looking at the cleared status on the screen, then at Maya, as if recognizing that the outcome had not unfolded within the boundaries he had initially assumed. Maya finally collected her documents with steady hands, her movement unhurried and deliberate. She turned slightly, preparing to leave the counter, as the bank returned fully to its ordinary state of transactions, though the memory of what had just occurred lingered quietly in the awareness of everyone who had witnessed it.